Hi, my name is Rick Brimacombe, and on behalf of the Minneapolis Club, Upsize Minnesota, and my group, Club Entrepreneur, welcome to the Family Business Guide. 50% of U.S. companies are family-owned, and our focus today is going to be on the family business and the unique set of challenges that they face. To help companies with all aspects of owning and managing family businesses, Club Entrepreneur and Upsize Minnesota has assembled today's event, and we're going to introduce a panel of experts who can serve as your trusted advisors. Upsize Minnesota is a how-to magazine devoted to helping business owners build bigger and more profitable companies. And Club Entrepreneur and my firm, Brimacombe Capital, support folks like you by helping refine strategies, assemble resources, and secure funding. In our efforts to provide actionable content, Upsize Minnesota and Club Entrepreneur offer you today's panel. And as such, I'd like to introduce you to our event sponsors. Avisen Legal is a general practice law firm. Highland Bank is a community banking firm. The Gustafson Group is a family business advisor, and White Oaks Wealth Advisors is a family office and asset management firm. Thank you very much to our wonderful and very supportive sponsors. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, to my immediate left is Eric Gustafson, managing partner of the Gustafson Group. Then we have Lisa Holter Ankle, attorney shareholder of Avisen Legal. And welcome back, Lisa. Rick Wall, CEO of Highland Bank. And Sharon Bloodsworth, CEO of White Oaks Wealth Advisors. Was anybody at last May's Family Business Guide event? A year and a quarter ago? Yeah, a couple of ago. Lisa Holter Ankle have done a number of different events with us in the past, as has Rick Wall. Sharon Bloodsworth has done a couple of different events with us, but has not done the Family Business Guide, so welcome, Sharon. And then Eric Gustafson and I have addressed this topic a number of times at the various breakfasts we have in talking about family businesses that he's working with and I am working with. So now that you've been introduced to everybody, let's hear a little bit from them as to how they fit into the topic today about family businesses. So each one of our panelists will take a minute or two to tell us about themselves. And let's start with you, Eric.
Great. Thanks, Rick. So in my career, I've been party to several sales in the lower middle market as a family member, investor, turnaround consultant, and board member. This morning, I'm going to focus specifically on my personal family business experience and my current practice of helping other family businesses as well. The short story is I went into business with my brother and father in 1991, turned around a niche printing business, grew it from 2 to 10 million, and sold to a public company 8 years later. In traction speak, I'm sure people have heard of traction in this room, my brother was the visionary and I was the integrator, although we didn't know it at the time, and as we were just plowing forward and building the business. My father did not work in the business, but was chairman of the board and ran our advisory committee. Prior to joining the business myself, I was attending graduate school at American University in Washington, D.C., studying public finance, after having had a 5-year career with U.S. Senator David Durenberger, running his finance office and expecting to have a career in public policy. So one day my brother called me and asked me if I wanted to be his business partner and go into digital printing. And I said, "What's digital printing?" So, a typical family business story. And so though I grew up talking business at the family kitchen table, my father was a quite accomplished entrepreneur. I never really gave it much thought that I would go into the business with my brother and my father until my brother called me. I wasn't that enamored with the East Coast, and so I jumped at the chance to move back to Minneapolis. From there, I started the ups and downs of joining the family business. I often say family business is not theoretical to me. I've lived it every step of the way, good and bad. So we did many things right, and some things I would change if I had to do it over. And this is what I'd like to share and discuss today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Eric. And Lisa, welcome back. And tell us a little bit about how you fit into today's topic.
Yeah, thank you. Well, here's an example as a corporate and business attorney of something I might be working on. My client, a business, the dad started a business running group homes. He, decades ago, got out of it a couple years ago of running the business, sold that, but it still has the real estate. He has 3 daughters, and he's finally feeling more comfortable bringing them into the business and giving them equal ownership. I think partly because it's not so much an operating business anymore, but there's still decisions to be made. 2 of the daughters are married, and one has a spouse who's really interested in the family business. The youngest is not married, and concerns about her, she's sort of lived the wild life, never had a stable job outside of the business. And the older sisters are a little concerned about who she might pick as a spouse that might then sort of come into that family business in a way. And the older sisters are also concerned about strategic decisions for the business, thinking, well, we're in residential real estate because it was a group home business, but maybe we should be diversified and should we be doing commercial real estate? So the daughters want to have a more formal process for decision making like a board and be part of that, as well as having their ownership. They want a plan of kind of how and when control is going to transfer to them. And they also have concerns about transferability of interests, thinking we're each married, we don't want necessarily the interest to be under the control of the spouse of a sibling or an ex-spouse of a sibling if that should happen. So I come in and I'm working with them to set up this formal board structure, put in a shareholder agreement, talk about who has rights to be on the board, what key decisions the board will make, and a buy-sell agreement with restrictions on transferability. So what I bring to my clients as an attorney is help them understand the legal rights in this situation of owner, director, shareholder, and think about tax consequences of transferring ownership, think about the ways property can be held to protect, provide the maximum protection, and resolve differences amongst them, and ultimately ensure that these decisions are reflected in appropriate legal documents. And so a little bit of my background, I've been an attorney for 25 years. I spent, before joining Upsize this summer, I was with Frederickson and Byron for 24 years, so slightly stable. Prior to that, I have a background in corporate finance and budgeting for with some Fortune 500s, and I worked in banking and public accounting. So I feel like I've got a good sense of what my clients think about. I work primarily with private companies, closely held. They're typically too small to have in-house counsel. And I tell people I work with clients sort of in that life cycle from formation to exit, and the key events in the life cycle of a business: forming it, bringing in owners, raising money, significant sales of products, growing potentially through acquisition, and sales at the end. I do a lot of M&A. And then just a little bit about Upsize. You've possibly not heard of it. It was formed about a year ago. It's a boutique business law firm formed by people like me with sort of decades of experience at big firms, big law firms, who wanted to try something different and be in a more collaborative environment and be more entrepreneurial. So there's 8 of us, and I think where we really excel is translating legal advice into practical business decisions. And we do things a little differently. We have very low overhead and try and leverage technology so that we can really add the most value for our clients and do things with some unique pricing alternatives like in-house counsel, where some clients subscribe and get reduced fees set in advance for our services. And that's me.
Great, thank you very much. And Rick, tell us a little bit about your background, and what's interesting is you're involved in multiple family businesses.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, currently my primary role right now is the CEO of Highland Bank, and Highland Bank is a $500 million bank in the Twin Cities. We have 5 locations around town, and our primary lending customer is small businesses. We are a preferred lender with the SBA. which means we spent the time and effort to be able to understand those products and get them to our customers without asking the government's permission. We make loans and then we tell the government what we've done later on. It's taken us a while to earn that, but it's one of the things we can really help our small business customers with. In fact, most or many of our small business customers are family businesses as well. So we work daily with family businesses, and I've been at Highland for over 20 years and have interfaced with many, many family businesses during that time. Personally, I have experience in family businesses in the sense that I'm an owner of Highland Bank, and our business is a small business as well. So I've got experience with financing, dealing with shareholder issues, etc., from a personal experience with my own family in the family business. My father was an entrepreneur. His primary business was real estate, and the setup of our family situation now is my parents have passed on most of their business assets to myself, my brother, and my sister. So we all share an ownership in a number of different ventures and have different roles according to whatever the venture is. I really have to hand it to my dad for having some good counsel and foresight, because he started the process of setting us up to work together early on when we started showing some indication that we'd be interested in working with him at all. I mean, when we graduated from college, we all went to the four corners of the country. Eventually, he called us back, and we started in different businesses. And now my brother and sister are primarily in the real estate business. I'm primarily in the banking business. We've also been involved in collections, aviation, and hospitality as well. So I also have, to make matters even more complicated, married a woman who was a fourth generation shareholder in a family business. That makes my kids fifth generation owners of that family business, and that business right now is going through a liquidation process. So as my kids say, I'm up to my genes in family business.
And you participated on this panel about a year and a half ago, so thank you and welcome back. And Sharon, thank you for coming back. You did a panel with us in January on women business owners, so thanks for that. Tell us a little bit about how you fit into the discussion on family businesses and your company and the family office side.
Perfect. Well, my name is Sharon. I own White Oaks Wealth Advisors and White Oaks Investment Management that's located in Florida. From a size perspective, we are the largest 100% women-owned independent investment firm in Minnesota. I purchased a family office with my partner 7 years ago, thanks to the Minneapolis Club and the connections here. I met my husband and found a family office to buy, and which was the best thing I ever got out of my membership. My husband was, and which was really lucky. And the intent for buying the family office was the lady that was selling it was really looking for a match to find somebody who loved their clients as much as she loved hers. And so it gave us a unique look into how to serve the very wealthy in Minnesota and what sort of services are required. So we're fairly sophisticated as a small firm. We do both onshore and offshore capabilities. Our investment sophistication is the same as a $100 million type client walking through the door. And we also offer more exotic trustee services, such as South Dakota asset protection trusts and things like that. I was headhunted a couple of times to head up single family offices here, but I can't say goodbye to my clients, so so that's it's just not a fit. But the sorts of things that we do for our families is that we really quarterback their relationships, that we really start with their values. We sit them down and ask them what's most important to them. Quite often family foundations get set up for a tax reason, or different estate transfers happen for taxes. And tax is never the reason. It's a wonderful benefit, but it's always what's important to the family. Because we look after multiple generations in the same families, we have a wonderful front seat to seeing what generation 2 and generation 3 feel and feel very differently compared to the first generation. So I think that from that perspective, we have a lot to add in terms of stories of things that we've experienced and different advice that we've collected over the years.
Great, thank you. So why don't we come on back here to this end. Eric, tell us a little bit about your perspectives on the topic today. Give us a little food for thought, and then we'll work back down the row and then get to some questions. And then also wanted to have this be interactive, so I'll do a little bit of kind of front-end frameworking around the topic, but please think of any questions you might have, and we'll have plenty of time to try to weave you into the conversation. So again, Eric, tell us a little bit about your perspectives on the topic.
Sure. Thanks, Rick. So when I start a client engagement, I spend quite a bit of time talking about what is known as the three circles model of family business, which is the family system, the management or business system, and the ownership system. And these circles intersect, and in a well-run business, they are in balance. So I actually, I put some of these on your table. You can see as a representation here, this is the three circles model in kind of a simple form. So my joke is that families go to the 4th of July picnic and all they do is talk about business. And then they go to business and all they do is talk about the 4th of July picnic. So, people get confused about which, hat they are wearing at what time. And as a family business, owner, manager, family member, I went through all that myself. And sometimes it's hard to know if you're in the system. So, but what you want is a balanced and clear vision of the future around these three circles, because I always say you want a great business and you want a great Thanksgiving. Because I think you're in business with your family because you love your family, and so it's a higher bar for a family to kind of get what they want. And statistically, most family businesses don't make it not because of the economy, but because they don't get along. So it's tricky stuff. As I said to a third generation family member, when you go to the cabin, that guy on the end of the dock fishing, that's your dad. And when you come to work, that's your boss's boss's boss. So there are two very different roles, and for both parties, knowing how to conduct themselves is really the key to success. So when I look back at my own family business experience, I think things we did right, at least we'll like this, we had a partnership agreement in place, a good buy-sell agreement, and we actually kept it updated. So I give us a pat on the back for that, because we were approached by a buyer kind of unexpectedly, and the sale went quickly. And so if we'd had to monkey around with buy-sell and formulas and all that stuff, I think it would have been a lot more complicated. We had an advisory board. I'm a big fan of advisory boards. I met 3 times per year with 2 non-family member CEOs, focused mainly on financial performance, sales, balance sheet items, and also kind of an added benefit was key personnel, kind of performance evaluation. So we had a couple non-family people in the business, a real top-notch CEO and sales management VP, so that was very helpful. Things I would have done differently from my own perspective, I wish there had been a formal onboarding process for myself, because even though I'd had a successful executive career, I mean, the learning curve was very steep and stressful. And in hindsight, I think just a little planning and training would have gone a long way. Compensation is another huge deal. On a family level, people have different wants, needs, family situations, and they're, of course, in different stages of life as well. And all the money that goes out of the company has to be balanced with all the money that you need to have in the company to pay the management and reinvest in equipment and such. So it can be very tricky. So in hindsight, I wish we would have had a formal subcommittee of our advisory board, non-family members, just to deal with compensation, bonus, dividend, reinvestment policy in a very specific and objective way. And I think this would have saved a lot of family wrangling and bruised feelings. And we made the classic business mistake of my brother and I shook hands and we said, we'll make the same amount of money forever. And, of course, things change, people change, and that was actually it was a good handshake on my part. Maybe not so much from my brother, but it shouldn't have been done that way. It was informal, and we should have done it very professionally. And I wish, as a last thing, we would have hired a conflict resolution facilitator, mediator, to check in periodically. And of course, we had all sorts of consultants, HR, lawyers, OSHA, and so a little money spent on kind of conflict resolution mediation, I think, would have been very well spent.
Great. Thank you very much. Lisa?
Yeah, well, in my experience, family businesses deal with all the same things any of my clients are going to encounter on a legal basis, but with all of the family dynamics, family baggage, sibling rivalry, parent-child dynamics, things like that. And I think of these dynamics that tend to show up in a couple ways. There's this desire often for equality. Mom and dad want to treat all the children equally, but the children might have different levels of involvement in the business. So 2 kids both own equal shares, but and have an equal say in the business, but only one is active in the business, and that can lead to can be a source of difference. I frequently see a discrepancy between effort and authority. So 2 family members own the business equally, put in vastly different amounts of time towards the business, but have an equal say in decisions and equal pay. So I've seen that, or close to it, and that can go well. But I've seen situations where that is a cause of conflict. Sibling rivalry and children who just don't get along. You were talking about, well, these are people you love, but sometimes it comes out the flip side of that, and people who somehow have the ability to irritate you more than anyone else. And you don't necessarily get that same dynamic I don't see that same dynamic in my non-family clients. And then there's this tension I see with parents, founders, and it's their biggest asset that they would ideally want to liquidate for funding their retirement. But they also have a strong desire many times to leave the business to their children, have that legacy, and you've got to figure out, well, how then, if you're going to give your children somewhat of the benefit of this business without paying top dollar, how do you fund your retirement for it? So I see those issues come up a lot, and many times I work with clients after they've encountered these issues, but I can think of some things that I would recommend my clients do, sort of thinking ahead and beforehand. And so some strategies, kind of a little bit more on a legal level, are, I'd say, use non-voting shares. If you're bringing your children into the business, you can give them the economic benefit of ownership, but no authority, so to speak. So kids get equal distributions of profits, but you reserve voting for people who are active in the business. Like there's a second tier where you might get voting shares. And this works even in S-corps, which a lot of family businesses are. If the desire for fairness is really strong, parents should think about leaving or gifting other assets to their children, not just the family business. And you can, that works well if there is something else to gift. But that said, don't automatically gift stock. Think about having family members buy in and pay over time using distributions of profits to help fund their purchase. And that can either help fund growth at the company if it's a direct issue from the company, or if you do a cross purchase from parents or other family members, it can help fund their retirement if you start thinking about that at an early level. Use time-based vesting of ownership. So gift or grant of shares that vests over time to make sure somebody is really intends to be actively involved and get skin in the game and want to stay with the company to see it grow. Do valuations of your company. And it's difficult. I know it's hard to get valuations on private companies. It can be expensive. There aren't always comparables. And it's something that I see many businesses, not just family businesses, go without, but it can really be helpful when you're dealing with events that come up, or an ask from a family member to buy in. If you've got some concrete info, data from an outside party, it makes a lot easier to say why somebody should be paying something or what that amount should be. Don't underestimate good record keeping. Have good ownership records, what was contributed, who owns what. I literally have this down here. Put compensation in writing.
That's good.
Protect the company's assets with confidentiality agreements, things like inventions, assignment agreements. If you're in an industry where people are doing creative things, where the company should own them, have non-competes, the same kinds of things that you would do with parties at arm's length, you should be doing in your family business. Because you might sell it, and that will be really helpful, but also because there's just a higher likelihood of dissent and disagreement. Have agreements in place to specify how key decisions are to be made, things like capital raises and sale of the business. Create a mechanism for dispute resolution amongst the owners, an outside party to do help with conflict resolution, or mechanisms for tiebreakers if two founders disagree. Think about and address the possibility of the owner's exit from the business. Is their stock subject to time vesting? Is there limits on a departing owner's right to continue to hold equity stock in the business? Would the departing owner have voting rights? And what restrictive covenants are there? And finally, and many of these things, great to think about in advance, can be put in place when companies are up and running. That's frequently when I get involved, and it's usually a little tougher discussion. Sometimes you have to kind of go backwards a little bit in terms of what has been done, and there's more effort to set the record differently. But I work with that in a lot of situations. And one option, finally, though, is think about if there really is dissent and disagreement, is there a way to split up the business? If you do it properly, you can do it on a tax-free basis where you defer the taxes. And this works well when there are separate divisions or lines, multiple product lines in a business. Might work with separate geographic locations, but I've seen that successfully work for just for family members who want to stay involved in the business, but can't work together or have different visions.
Great, thank you. Rick?
Yeah, Rick, a couple things that have come to mind that I think my experience has shown have been real helpful for me personally and other businesses I've seen is if you have the opportunity to foresee your family members coming into the business, take some time to really think through what that might mean for your family, for you, for your spouse, and not just the important things, not just the nuts and bolts kind of important things that you would consult your attorney for, or you would consult your wealth advisor or your accountant for. Those are all significant, but also the soft items as well. What are the skills that your children have? What are their interests? How might they actually interact together? And start that process early so that you can begin a dialogue that will help when your kids do ultimately take control. They have a background as to why they're there, how they got there, why it's appropriate for them to be there, and you've started a dialogue about the business between the three, in my case the three, but between the siblings about how things are going to work. And starting that and doing that at one day can be pretty difficult. So if you can do that over a period of time, you really, I think, improve your opportunity for having success in terms of longevity and good management in the business. Another thing that I think is critical and has been a benefit for us is to try to have as good a communication as possible. If you see your siblings or your family members are starting to look bored and disinterested, you're now hitting about the right level of communication, because you've got to get to that so that they feel like they're getting everything that they need. Because at some point, there will be critical decisions that need to be made. And if your family members don't understand what's happening, the chance that they'll make good business decisions is less than if they understand what's going on. So keep them informed and keep the communication up and keep it two-way. Another item that I think has been significant for us, and I've seen it significant in other businesses as well, is try to find a way to provide liquidity for people who own the business. It can be tough in a small business, but to the extent you can figure out a way for someone to sell their shares or even to sell some of their shares or to get some liquidity, it limits the problem that you might have later on, which is, gee, all my wealth is wrapped up in that business. They're all playing with it. I don't get to play with my wealth. I want to do that. If you can put on the table an opportunity for, well, here's what you do to get some of your wealth, now it becomes their own decision as opposed to a decision that's put upon them by their family members. And it can really change someone's attitude. They may never execute to it, but if that door's open, that complaint about my wealth being tied up really dries up quickly. Another thing is, and Eric mentioned this earlier, and I support it, you really have to be able to separate business time and family time. It isn't that hard to do once you figure out how to do it. We all, I think, have learned how to have a little bit different interaction with different types of groups. And you can look at a sibling and act one way in a business meeting and then act another way at home and have it be entirely genuine. It doesn't have to be disingenuous, but you've got to be able to, if you want to maintain a good family relationship, you've got to be able to do both. Talk about businesses, issues when it's business issue time and have real open dialogue. And then when it's family issue time, you want to be able to interact on the family issues, not crossing one over to the other. I mean, we were really fortunate that when we started out, we went through the process of working with a number of consultants. We worked with McGladrey to do individual analysis. We worked with Tom Hubler, which is in a similar business to what Eric is doing. Actually, when we looked, this is back almost 20 years ago, there weren't many opportunities, and now there are more people who can help you with that, with those kind of resources. The last thing I'd add is, as your governance improves and the size of your business improves, bring in third-party, non-family members into the governance to help you understand about the business. That is, bring non-family members onto the board. Even if it isn't a official board, you can have a group of advisors or somebody who can help you be a sounding board for when you have really difficult issues. And if that isn't put in place when things are going well, it can be really difficult to add it when things are going poorly, because by then people have entrenched positions and they don't hear the outside voice as reasonable as they might if it was always there. So those are some thoughts.
Great, thanks, Rick. Sharon.
So for the business owners in the room, I put a quiz on your table that essentially says, if today is your last meal at the Minneapolis Club, I hope you ate dessert, how would your business be negatively impacted? It was funny to see that every country has its own proverb. In the US, it's shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Mexico says father merchant, son playboy, grandson beggar. In China, it's from peasant shoes to peasant shoes in 3 generations. Germany is quite funny. The first generation creates, the second generation inherits, and the third destroys. And then Italy's much more prolific with from the stable to the stars and back again. So every country has the same effect where, again, generally wealth is destroyed within 3 generations. So when you look at the different generations, you really need to step back and understand. Generally, either the mother or the father that started the business quite often started from having some sort of negative experiences growing up that drove them to really create something massive out of nothing. The second generation quite often watched mother and father do this, so they still have an inkling of where it started and still have some of the same spirit. And the third generation was quite often just brought up in wealth. And so it's very hard for the first and second generation to really truly understand the third generation, just because they're miles apart. We always protect our children from bad things in life. So you don't generally talk about the most horrible things that have happened to you. And you always want better for your children than you had for yourself. But one of the most important exercises to do is to really sit back and think about the 10 worst things that happened to you in life, the really 10 things that shaped who you are today. Very rarely do we share those with our family. Sometimes you're ashamed of them. Sometimes you're very proud of how it's changed you, but you don't really let people understand the lessons. So in order to create wealth in the future, you can protect it through estate planning techniques and trusts and different things, but the best thing you can possibly do within families is really teach your family to fish. How you created it, what you've done, how to pick good advisors around you, sort of how to select people carefully, how to do good business, and then how to continue to recreate the business going forward, because usually what got you there won't get you to where you need to be in the future. And a lot of the miscommunication happens just because of the lack of understanding between generations. So, for example, if the younger generation has a fancy car and they're not really taking care of it, and the older generation just cannot simply understand why they don't covet it the way that they did. And so the first thing you have to do as the sort of matriarch or patriarch of the company is really look in the mirror and look at who you are and how you were created and what's important to you. You may well find that your children don't have the same drive that you have, and you'd be surprised how many conversations that we have where the second generation or third generation, they did it out of obligation but not out of a love for what they wanted to do. And some clients purposefully look to having their children do things outside of the family business, just so that they can live the life that perhaps the parent wasn't allowed to live themselves. So really understanding sort of what's important for the business and then what's also important for the family are two completely separate things. You always know your children best as to how they can manage money, whether you have to put very tight controls on the future to have the money last down generations or not. One of the biggest fallacies is for, as I mentioned before, for gifting, is that quite often large family foundations are created for tax reasons, and it's a wonderful benefit, and the love for giving is in that first generation. Sometimes you can have future generations that wish that money came to them instead of into the foundation. They don't have the same love for it, and so don't always think that what you want to do for the family is what's going to last, and that's why it changes over time. So the other part with sudden wealth that impacts sort of the future generations is it changes your life. I always say that if you have over 20 million, then it usually impacts the relationships around you. Sometimes you have new friends. You would be surprised that the wealthier you get, the larger the entourage you generally have, which is really sad because usually your entourage is paid for as well by you. And so it's very frustrating to see that. And so you really have to counsel your children on picking their friends well, really the value of hard work. There's an awful lot of dysfunction in very, very wealthy families, again, because if you haven't ever had to work, then there's no self-esteem there. There's nothing worse than standing in the shadow of a powerful parent that you just can't live up to. So I would say that when you look at your family, it really is the family decision as to what's best for the family and what we want to do. A lot of these issues can be resolved in family meetings where you're really talking about it. But the nice thing is if you can find an advisor that will work with all of the family so they can understand all perspectives, I always think that's best, as they're really the mediator between all of them. The more you can get into the room at the same time, the better, as long as you have a good referee. But it's a real joy and it's a real privilege to watch that, and it's amazing how wealth can be built but also destroyed very quickly.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I have a specific question for each one of the panelists, which I want to get through. At that point, I have some other questions, which I will continue to use unless you all want to jump in. So again, this is an opportunity to have a dialogue here, so think about what kind of questions you would like to ask. So let me start with Rick. And this was something that we've talked about before. You were on the panel last year, but I thought we would start here as kind of a point in the conversation. What are important family dynamics that business owners, family business owners need to understand?
Well, yeah, after listening to Sharon, I think it's to be Generation 2. I'm fortunate in that way. No, one of the things that we had I think a fairly thought out and reasonable process to go through in terms of trying to build a family group that would be able to communicate and work through challenges that ultimately arise. And but one of the things I think we didn't really realize is when my brother and sister and I all came to work for my father in one form or another, we were all single. So we sat down, we all grew up together, we had drank the Kool-Aid from way back when, we knew the language, we knew how things worked, and then each one of us went out and found somebody to get married to. And so we brought them all into the family and realized that there's a whole nother level of communication and understanding that has to happen once you start to add spouses into the family mix. And that was something I don't know how we could have planned for it, but when it happened, we realized we needed to do something more than what we'd done already, and to try to get them to understand how we work, how we interact, and because they are very important members of the family, and unless you understand that they're there and they're going to be there to stay, you might have the attitude that they're on the outside, and that just makes for a real problem, I think, for the individual who's married and for the family business as a whole. So make certain you take spouses into account when you deal with your family business.
Great, thank you. Eric, let's come down here. Touch on a little bit about the business owner's son or daughter showing interest in joining the family business, and what kinds of things would you suggest for helping that work smoothly and good from everyone's perspective?
Sure. Well, first I would say, does the person really have a desire to join the business? And you're not Mark Zuckerberg. So, anyone under 25 thinks they're Mark Zuckerberg. So the reality of what, the business is, the ball bearing factory or whatever, is that something you really desire to do? And oftentimes people might feel obligated to join the family business, and then they wake up mid-career. And I actually had a mid-40s person say, I really want to be a teacher, but where does a teacher make $250,000? And, in mid-40, it's hard to switch it up. And then secondly, are they qualified to be in the business? So if you put that job out on monster.com and get 10 resumes back, would that person actually be qualified relative to other people? Doesn't mean they have to be exactly that person, and there's all sorts of things you can do in gap analysis and training and such that could get them to that level. So, but being qualified is very important if you want to make money. And then last, if it's a college graduate, best practice would say go spend 5 years somewhere else, learn to be an employee, learn to get reviewed, learn all sorts of things that when you're hanging around the family is not probably going to come your way. And it's all a benefit to the person, the child, because I've seen, once the entitlement train gets running, it's really tough to get back. So, again, that would be my suggestion.
Great, thank you. Sharon, jumping down to you, assuming a business owner followed Eric's advice and the transition went well and the siblings children and siblings came into the business. You touched a little bit on the challenges of keeping the business multi-generationally. What advice do you have for your family business clients to improve their odds so that the business can continue through the generations?
Well, I would say it comes down to there being two types of survival in a company: survival for today and survival for tomorrow, and they're really in two different camps. The first one is today, is again making sure you have the best business advice, best business training, and setting up the future, and also learning to diversify your assets. I can say that working with business owners, it's like getting blood out of a stone. You're getting them to save elsewhere. Most people have I would say most, that's a complete generalization. Many people have an aversion to investing in the market or other things, but really have a love for what they know. So an awful lot of wealth stays within the family business, which can be fairly dangerous if things change. The other part is that you'd be surprised how many families are ill prepared for tomorrow. Their buy-sell agreements haven't been looked at lately. They haven't thought about, again, when you bring spouses into the mix. In the yesteryear, divorce was far less frequent, and you quite often have the new spouse coming into the marriage being part of the family, whereas it's quite different. And even from an estate planning perspective, so I would say that making sure that all of your documents are very current and they actually are very practical to what you actually want. You'd be surprised how many times we have to translate what people think that their documents say. And so you go through every disaster clause. What if this person died? What if this person got divorced? What if this person was disabled? Really understanding how you work through all of the transitions. I'd also say that when you look from a financial perspective, there's an awful lot of insurance that's set up a long time ago, and quite often those policies were set up when interest rates were higher. So they're actually failing policies, and again, having those conversations and always rechecking everything that you have to make sure that everything is current and is still functionable. Is really important. The other part is that, again, if you're insuring for different events to happen, if you have massive success, all of those can be often be left in the past. So I would say, go and revisit go back to your tax preparer, go back to your attorney, and your banker often. Even though you'd be surprised how few people have the time or the inclination to do so. And so their next generation, the succession part of it is very, it's a mess on death. We deal with spouses of family businesses that have died, and when we have the opportunity to be able to get in there and work with them, we really say you need to document every procedure, everything that you have in place if you've not transitioned any of that information so far. So again, somebody knows exactly where each of the pieces are.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Lisa, a couple times the topic of these family members that are in the business versus family members that are out of the business have come up. Can you make some suggestions on how to manage that and address that again so that hopefully everybody ends up coming out of it at least moderately satisfied?
Yeah, this is less of a legal advice. It's not like a formal board, but I've worked with clients who have family councils. They're kind of all different kinds of things. It's not your formal board of directors. It's not your board of advisors. The family council is comprised of the family members who both own and work in the business or just own the business. So this is for families that have, the business has been passed on and now there's or you've got people in both roles. And it's a mechanism people set up to meet regularly. Now that could be quarterly or monthly. It could just be once a year. It could be a short time frame over the next year, we're going to do this, or it could be just, hey, we're here for the long haul, 10 years. It does not manage the business. It does not get into the day-to-day business decisions, but it addresses family concerns and issues that relate to the business. So you've got a family member working who needs a car but can't afford it. The family council decides how to bridge that gap. Somebody needs a loan. The family council will decide, should we set up a fund to make loans to family members? They might decide things like Rick was saying with regard to setting up a mechanism for liquidity. Frequently, you'll have family members who have had to forego income during tough times at the company. The family council can think of ways and consider how to fairly compensate that person later for lost income earlier. I've seen family councils that kind of set up and think about plans on 3 different levels. For individual family members, what are your professional goals and how are you going to meet them sort of in the realm of the family? The whole family plan, what are the family goals? Do we want to transition the business? Do we want to sell it? What resources do we need? And then a business plan that kind of thinks about overall ownership and management. Is it time to bring in professional management and strategic direction of the business? So that, I think, it's a non-legal, it's not binding, but it's a really good mechanism for working through a lot of the issues.
Great, thank you. Any questions out there at this point? All right, next one on my list. It's come up a little bit about this family meeting and communications and so forth. So family meetings are a tool to help the family members get along. How should those meetings be structured, and what should be discussed during those meetings? And this is kind of an open question. Feel free to jump in, whoever would like to.
Well, I would say that every family meeting is unique. You generally sit down with the first generation and really establish the rules of engagement. Some things are to be shared and some things aren't. You'd be surprised how many clients don't actually want to share the actual dollar value with their children. I think that's and it depends if they're going to have to manage it, it's different, but if it's just going to be something that's received, I think that's very important. I spoke at a conference down in Florida on how not to ruin your children with money. And this woman ran up to me afterwards and said that her husband didn't receive his trust until he was 50, and which he thought was very unfair. But on reflection, he would never have set up the company he has today had he just been given the money earlier. So you'd be quite surprised. And so I think that is an important component to understand what level of information needs to happen. And then there's always a goal. Is that what do we want to accomplish from this? You would be surprised that a lot of sometimes litigation and bad feelings in family happens around shared real estate. So it's who's borrowing this now, who's using it. So you always, so quite often it's crafting agreements around usage and fairness and sort of setting some of those ground rules. But I would say there's no real formula other than making sure that everybody knows that it's very open, but it's also meant to be very helpful and useful, and not to have the conflict within the meeting.
I'd share a little bit about our experience, and that is early on we started a family council and had that process in place for a couple of years, and it was a good opportunity for us to join, even especially the spouses involved into the process. We also had a retreat where we would go away and talk about business, and eventually the spouses rebelled and said, we're not going to some sunny place sitting inside while it's nice outside. We're going to make this a family trip and screw the business. So we wound up just going after a couple of years of going and having a together family time, and we reserved time at home to do the family meeting. And that has since evolved into having just individual meetings for company-related activities to whatever company we're involved in. And then once a week we have a call just to clear any issues that are going on that have more immediacy. So that's been our evolution, and it's working well for us now.
And on that weekly call, are there outside people on that call, or is it just you and your siblings?
Just the siblings.
Okay, all right. Great. Anybody else on the topic of family meetings?
Sure. I would suggest having a facilitator is something that's very helpful. I actually chair a couple second generation committee meetings, and I prepare the agendas, and so keeping it all very professional and having a facilitator there, my experience is that helps a lot.
Yeah, I think the advice that I gave on the family council is probably what I'd suggest here too.
Okay, great. Okay, a couple times outside perspectives have come up in the discussion here. Sounds like it's very important as well as valuable to have some outside perspectives brought in. How does one go about attracting an advisory board or board of directors or family council that includes non-family members?
Well, I would start with your network, and you probably have professionals in your network right now, and start asking who might be a good fit. And if it's a family business, you want somebody that's sensitive not just to the business, but also the family as well, which not everybody is.
Yeah, I think that's difficult. I know, Eric, you mentioned that your business had an advisory board, and I've seen clients struggle trying to find people to fill that role. It can be tricky. So one thing I'll also suggest is to look for facilitated groups that bring in people, peers, and not competitors, in a format to support business issues and decisions, like Women Presidents Organization. NABO has a mastermind group, things like that, and some of them are facilitated, some aren't. But if you don't have that an advisory board, something like that is a good way to get input from your peers on issues related to the business.
Sharon, Rick?
So I belong to a peer-to-peer group for CEOs and family business members for the last 12 years, and I can say that a lot of conversations are often around the dysfunctions of your board. I always say quite proudly that I think the most efficient form of government is to be a benevolent dictator, and that doesn't always go down well. But if you pull from sort of YPO or Vistage or other organizations, the smartest people you know, I would say fill your board with people who are different to you, because if somebody has the same opinion as you, well, then you're just listening to yourself again. Filling the board with people who have different strengths than you do. Perhaps if someone's more financial, somebody has softer skills or communication skills. But it's very lonely at the top, and quite often the business owners have built themselves up by being frugal, so that they're less inclined to want to pay for help. In which case, then you just need to sort of cobble it together with the smartest people you know. And I always think if they're not smarter than you, you'll have nothing to learn.
Anything to add, Rick?
Just our experience in setting up a family council, we found some outside advisors, and we did pay them, and we did it they might have done it not for free, but we wanted to make certain that it was meaningful to them and to us, that we were committed to this. Actually, what we learned from them after a little while was they said, all you're doing is reporting to us. We want you to ask us things that we could advise you on. And so that was kind of an evolution in our overall governance process, that if you're going to invite people in to be your advisors, you got to ask their advice too. So that helped us.
Okay. Succession planning has come up a couple of times. What types of succession plans can family businesses put into place? How early should that process start? And what suggestions do you have around succession planning?
Well, I would say start the earlier the better. I'm part of a planning that's they have a professional CEO that's going to be there another decade, and so yeah, and it's a great business, and the owners aren't that old, and I preach kind of baby steps, and I think there's this kind of mystique that there's some magical succession plan. Here's the magic succession plan, and it's really based on the family and the business and your budget and your time. And there's all sorts of things that, there are, of course, best practices, but my experience is every family is different, every business is different. And I like to say I meet people where they are, because that seems to be what they want the most.
Yeah, I would think one of the things that you really need to start off with is thinking about what the owners really want and what their goals are long term. If maximizing cash flow is the goal versus having a legacy left to the family, those two goals may not be fully compatible. And if legacy is the priority, the business owners should start thinking about funding their retirement very early, that they're not going to be able to cash in or extrapolate extract all the value of the business. It can take years to identify a successor, whether it's somebody in your family or a key employee. So it really is a long-term process. But consider getting valuations of the company. Sometimes knowing that your company has a high value and a high marketability is going to give you insight that the best way, the best choice will be to sell to an outsider, and that'll be best for the founder and others in the family. And the opposite is true. If you know that that's not the way that value isn't there, it can make other decisions easier.
I just add, I mean, the traditional succession planning issues are the same with the family business as a non-family business, except you have the family layer on top. And so you certainly want to start having dialogue with the family members whenever you feel it's appropriate. One of the things our family council did was determine at what age our kids could start working in our businesses if they were ever to choose to do that. And we did that when our oldest was about 4. And so this year had the first time any one of them came and interned at Highland Bank this year. And so it was good that we had that plan in place. So that helped. That's how we handled that with internal succession.
Yeah. And I would say that, I mean, your succession plan has to start today, or otherwise you'll reduce the value of your business unintentionally. If we look at some families, follow the money. You look at where, so for example, if some family members that are not involved in the family are the ones that are going to be receiving shares upon death, starting to have them involved, starting to report to them, starting the conversations, because the thing is, if you leave without a plan, then you'll destroy a family, because then everyone will start arguing and they have different intentions. And so the more that you can plan for earlier, the better. And again, going back to your documents and really living them. Quite often you put a buy-sell together pretty quickly and put in a sort of evaluation metric that you think is reasonable, but it may have been 20 years ago. And so really refreshing and really planning for your worst case scenario now is the smartest thing to do as a family.
Great, thank you. Questions out there?
Yes. So I want to go back to the bringing in the outside advisors thing briefly. Not the family council or the advisors, but the actual board of directors. We're contemplating this now. How do you do it in a way that you don't disrupt the operators or, the management? It's a totally new dynamic for them. And we're looking at it obviously from a family perspective, but it's going to be a whole other layer of bureaucracy for the managers.
Sure. So let me
any advice there?
Yeah, let me reiterate that so anybody over here didn't hear it, but also for the video's sake. Gentleman's question was about bringing in a board of directors from the outside. How do you do that in a way that's not disruptive to the operating team? And now you have a whole nother layer that you haven't been dealing with. So what kinds of tips on making that transition to a more formal board of directors work?
Yeah, I'll start. Any organization, in essence, legally would have some kind of management level, whether you call it a board of governors or board of managers, board of directors, and the owners of the business elect them or appoint them. So there should be, if there's some overlap between managers and owners, there should be that kind of buy-in. I wouldn't recommend that you have all of your advisors be outside, that all of your board members be outside. The majority should be involved with the company. The board, though, is not the mechanism to run the business day to day. It's there to set strategic decisions. and provide advice and counsel and direction to management. So boards meet usually quarterly, sometimes less frequently. And there should be a set agenda that the management helps put together. So they should be bringing issues at a high level to the board where they think they can get additional advice and expertise and use the board as a resource. And so maybe setting it up to think of it that way as opposed to just another level of bureaucracy. The management, in essence, do report to the board, and the board definitely has legal authority over them. But it really should be viewed as a mechanism for dialogue and advice.
Yeah, I had to echo that because the experience I had was when I came to work at Highland Bank, my dad was the primary shareholder, and the board meetings were essentially telling him everything that happened in the bank for that month, down to the lowest level, and they would be full-day meetings once a month. And so that's the way it was when I came there. We've tried to change that, and I think we've made a lot of progress towards that. We have elevated the level of the board's involvement to more strategic, more guidance, more policy related, and cut out a lot of the day-to-day management kind of questions and conversations that used to happen. We now have 5 meetings a year. They're about 3 hours each, and the board has delivered certain information, but not everything that's gone on in the bank during that period. And I think it really helps the management know that they're running the bank, and it helps the board focus on the things that are significant. So if you set up your board appropriately with that expectation, not that they're going to go down and tell someone how to run that machine or how, this invoice should be paid on a later date or something like that, that their goal is to be strategic, look at policy, look at the overall direction, provide that kind of guidance, I think you'll be on a much better path.
Yeah, I would say, of course, there's a difference between a fiduciary board and an advisory board, and there's different, I have clients that pay $500 a meeting for an advisory board and pay $4,000 a meeting for fiduciary. So if you're just starting out, sometimes just having a couple advisors on an advisory basis, to kind of get things going is very helpful.
Yes, I would just add that you want to be very clear up front whether you're looking for people to advise you or truly people that are going to have oversight over the company and have the ability to remove the CEO if needed. That's a very serious thing within a family. So again, especially in the infancy, you want to be very, very clear about what you need. So for example, if you have a retiring first generation where you really do need a board that oversees the next generation because they don't quite have the skills, that's very different than asking somebody for their input and advice.
Yep, actual board members, not advisory board members, but statutory board members have legal duties, fiduciary duties owed, and there are a lot of responsibilities and liabilities that come along with that. And they get to make the decisions such as should the CEO be fired or who should be brought in. An advisory board, you can take it or leave it what they say. So you have to think about them in different ways, and organizations can have both.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? All right, so panel, whoever would like to take this, or all of you, what's a common issue that you see causing problems for family businesses? Is there kind of one big mistake that business owners, family business owners often make? Common problems, one big mistake.
I see family businesses where there's one person who doesn't pull their weight, and there's limitations on firing them because of the family relationship, or moving them out of the role into something else within the family business. And so someone else has to do their work. That's unfair. It leads to resentment, and dysfunction within the business, and so it's not a great relationship, and it's also bad for the business. So, communication up front, but treating employees, treating employment of family members the same way you treat employment of non-family members, I think is a good step to potentially, hopefully, avoiding that problem. Job descriptions, annual reviews, comparables on market pay, and bringing in outsiders, coaching for people with difficult personalities, training if there's a lacking skill set, the things that any employer in human resources would think about. And if you set mechanisms up in your business for that in advance, when there is a problem, it's much easier to implement it.
Great, thank you.
People say to me, should we talk about it? And I always say, yes, we should talk about it. We shouldn't fight about it. You can have good conflict, but that's where sometimes, I'm a state certified mediator, somebody that's objective and knows. A lot of people just don't know how to communicate. And so sometimes teaching people how to communicate, as simple as one person talks at a time. And I've done a lot of that. So I would say it's hard to over communicate if you're doing it in the proper way.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges I've seen for a few different businesses is that the oldest generation doesn't clearly communicate what's going on or what their attitude is about the business. So the next generations are kind of sitting there wondering what's going to happen. And that can be really hard on both sides. I think if you find yourself in that situation, you can certainly find someone to help you with that, like Eric or somebody could help you start that dialogue. You don't have to have the decisions made, but if there's no dialogue and everyone's wondering what Grandpa's doing or what's his plans are, and he's now 92 and kind of wobbly, it's really bad for the business. It can be really bad for the business. And then if he hasn't made a plan, then it can be a full-on family feud when he passes. So that's the biggest mistake I see.
Yeah, and I think probably the biggest mistake that I see, or the error, is just the procrastination in creating the plan. It's so much easier to work in your business versus on your business. And it's very different when we can all go home and you can leave work at home versus going home and then all your family members are still sitting there across the table looking at you. So there's a lot of conflict avoidance and lack of planning just because you don't think that your adult children are ready to start the process. And you'd be surprised how ready they are before you think they are. And you should test them.
All right, so we're getting close to 1 o'clock to kind of wrap things up. And again, we can stay here in the room as long as anyone would like. I'm sure the panelists can stick around to talk to anybody who has specific questions for them. But as you kind of look at our topic today, things that have been shared, maybe some things that you didn't get an opportunity to share, maybe you could share one quick thing of folks, something for them to avoid, as well as something for them to remember to do.
I think you should remember to properly communicate, and I think compensation is a big area that causes a lot of fights with family members, and dealing with that professionally and appropriately goes a long way to making things better.
Yeah, one recommendation I'd have is for owners and founders to buy key man life insurance and put that in place. Great mechanism to help buy out an interest when somebody's unexpectedly gone, for the other family members to deal with that. So good thing to do, and things to avoid. Don't create two classes of employees, the family member employees versus those who aren't family members. You'll disincentivize your good employees who aren't part of the family, who may think, well, I'm never going to get, I won't be eligible for the same bonuses and pay. And that's just not a good thing to do. You want to keep your good employees just as happy as your family employees.
Great, thank you.
I'd say do communicate often, frequently, the good and the bad. And I'd say don't not communicate frequently the good and the bad.
You want to clarify that a little bit, or?
Have I not been communicating up here? I mean, this is what it's like to be in a family business, right here. You're seeing it. What did he say? He didn't say anything.
And for me, I would go back and share the proverbs with your adult children and grandchildren, and just say, what are we going to do as a family to help us survive into the 4th and the 5th and the 6th generation, and what decisions do we have to make today to make that possible? So avoid the procrastination, avoid the conflict avoidance, and just collect all your advisors around you, get all your documents updated, and plan for the future.
Great, thank you. So for future events, you can check out clube.com. You can sign up for a newsletter there and see a list of different things that are going on. Upsize Magazine, the website is upsizemag.com. And Wes Bergstrom is right up here in the front if you'd like to talk to Wes about Upsize Magazine. Thank you very much for coming. Again, we have the room as long as anyone would like to stay, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.